We're completely innocent, so we destroyed all the evidence. Evidence of what? What evidence? Who said anything about evidence? We didn't do anything wrong. Okay, so why did you instruct staff to shred and burn classified documents, which is against US federal law? That imaginary dialogue sums up the fiasco that has taken place over the past 48 hours at what now remains of USAID. After having 83% of its programs permanently cancelled by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the agency's acting executive secretary, Erica Carr, who is a holdover from the Biden administration, sent out an email on Tuesday morning asking the agency's remaining staff at the former HQ building in Washington to spend the whole day methodically destroying the very files and documents that would have been needed to prove that the multiple accusations made against USAID were false. Now, for reference, the British colonial government in Kenya and the apartheid government in South Africa are the other two examples of similarly large bureaucracies that have ordered the widespread destruction of records when they were about to become defunct. The British in Kenya were trying to cover up the large-scale detention and torture program, which targeted Kenya's anti-colonial movements, where they did things like force broken bottles into the vaginas of Kenyan women and sodomize Kenyan men also with broken bottles for the crime of resisting the theft of their land by British land thieves. Then the apartheid government in South Africa was covering up, well, everything. Whatever they say they did, those guys did it. So it makes you wonder, what on earth could USAID be hiding which would make it adopt the methods of mid-century colonial cover-ups in Africa? Maybe, I don't know, constantly funding the military and political destabilization of resource-rich African countries, ensuring that they never attain the conditions necessary for sustained economic development, which would, by the US government's own reckoning, threaten America's economic interests? Maybe funding the vast civil society infrastructure that functions as a de facto American shadow government across Africa and the global south, which sometimes wields more power than the actual governments in those places. Maybe serving as a vast foreign slush fund and a political kickback scheme for well-connected operators in Washington. Sometimes we have more answers than questions. But the main issue here is that wherever you are in the world, if you have a pulse and some sort of useful resource buried under your feet, chances are USAID and its multiple public and pseudo-private affiliates have spent decades pumping money into the civil society ecosystem in your country, supposedly to promote democracy, transparency, and civil freedom. And if your government didn't allow them to, chances are they have spent decades trying to overthrow your government because democracy uber alles. Apparently, democracy was meant to ensure that things like this don't happen. But clearly, when they still happen in the world headquarters of democracy, then something is not adding up. And that something is the following three tough truths that many will find hard to swallow, but will eventually have to come to terms with as the US-led unipolar world order comes to an end. First, that the US itself is not and has never been a democracy. Apart from the fact that it's a constitutional republic where the democratic exercise of power is more of a convention than a rule, the American government also concentrates the vast majority of its power into the hands of unelected bureaucrats and regularly classifies important public information, which makes it completely inaccessible to the public for an indeterminate period of time, sometimes 30 years, sometimes 60 years, sometimes God knows how long. That is not an open society. Nobody in the history of America has ever voted for USAID or the State Department or the CIA to spend hundreds of millions of dollars training and equipping non-state actors to go around killing hundreds of thousands of poor people in countries they cannot find on a map and whose names they can't pronounce. American voters simply do not have the power to make decisions regarding anything that fundamentally affects America's place in the world. From the US foreign policy on Africa, which designates the continent as a source of raw materials and nothing more, to the deployment of the US dollar as the country's primary export and chief weapon, to the constant pillaging of the economies of Africa, Asia, and South America for cheap goods and cheap labor to feed the US consumer economy, American voters have no say in any of these things. They can only vote for one charismatic liar who campaigns on identity or culture wars, or vote for another charismatic liar who campaigns on identity or culture wars. The story of American-style democracy sold to the rest of the world is a lie. The second truth, as laid out by former Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, is that there must be certain preconditions, including an economically engaged, politically educated, and physically secure population, which means that across many parts of the world where US actions have severely delayed or thwarted economic development or created instability, such as in many parts of Africa, any attempt to copy and paste this false notion of democracy using the American-funded civil society model will lead to the phenomenon known as isomorphic mimicry, which is where a country on paper has all the institutions, laws, regulations, and assorted paraphernalia of what purports to be a functioning democracy, but is simply a non-functional parody of itself. The third truth, which follows from the first two, is that if a country which itself is no democracy uses its global civil society extensions to heavily fund the promotion of isomorphic mimicry in places where its own actions have made actual democracy impossible, then that country is not trying to fix the problem, but perpetuate it, because doing so is profitable. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how neocolonialism works. The more you know.